Greetings, students, and welcome to Modern World History. This is a course that technically begins in the 1700s, but in this lecture, we're going to go ahead and we're going to give you an overview of the world of around the year 1700, but we're going to give you some or I'm going to give you some backstory. That royal we, so silly. Now, before we get on to that, there are just a few terms that you need to be familiar with. The first one is BCE CE. You're probably familiar with the BC AD terms, the year 300 BC or the year 1500 AD. That's an idea that historians have been moving away from and towards the system of Common Era and before Common Era. The years are the exact same thing as BC and AD, BCE and CE. But just be aware that when you hear that, you're not going to get a whole lot of before Common Era because we're a modern world history course. But when you hear that word CE, make sure that you're just aware that it's the same thing as AD. It means Common Era, but it's the same year as any other of our modern years. This is, when I'm recording this right now, 2021 CE. Also be aware of century names like 17th century. 17th century is actually in the 1600s. It's one of those things that the way the math works out, it can be a little weird for our brain. So if you hear a number of a century, you kind of have to go back to the previous set of numbers in order to accurately identify it. The easiest way to think about this is the very first 100 years of the Common Era, 1 through 100, were the first century CE. So of course years 101 through 200, all those 100s have to be the second century CE. Just be aware of that. You're going to hear the word dynasty a whole lot in this lecture. And a dynasty is just a family that maintains political power. I mean, it can mean more beyond that. We've talked about sports teams that have long-lasting legacies being called dynasties. But in the political realm, in the historical realm, usually what we're talking about is a family that holds power in some way over the course of multiple generations. You're also going to hear the terms early modern and modern. Technically, what we're doing in this course is almost all the modern period. The early modern period of history comes right after the medieval period. You've probably heard of the Middle Ages or the medieval period. The early modern period goes from around the year 1500 to around the year 1800. And then the modern period is around the year 1800 up until the modern day. There's some discussion amongst that, or some disagreement amongst historians as to when those dates should be laid out, but it's really stuff that we just make up to be able to keep easier track of everything. So early modern, 1500 to 1800, modern, 1800, all the way up to the present. And finally, in terms of terms, you're going to hear or read the word circa. Circa just means around, like a circle. So if I say that something happened circa 1800, that means it happened around the year 1800, maybe 1798, maybe 1802. And sometimes you'll just see abbreviated as C, so C period 1800 CE. Now, one last thing I'm going to go over before we get into the meat of this lecture is note-taking. We're going to cover a lot of information in this course, and if you really try to capture every last little tiny bit of it, it's going to be overwhelming. One of the skills that you're going to be working on throughout the semester in this history course is how to take a lot of information and boil it down to its essence. What I want you to do in this lecture is that every time we come to a new slide in the background, I want you to come up with one summary statement for that slide. Is whatever I'm talking about in that, I want you to come up with one sentence essentially, though I encourage you to not write even full sentences in your notes. One full sentence that will capture what that part of the lecture is really about. Now, underneath that, you can bullet point specific bits of information. You definitely want to catch anything that has a date on it or a specific name, but you also want to make sure you're capturing all the concepts. You should be able to look back through your notes and read each summary of each chunk of the lecture, or if you're doing the readings, each chunk of the readings, and you should be able to go through your notes and very quickly look over your summary statements to give you a reminder of what everything was about. And when you're doing things like writing the papers that we will this semester, or if you are giving an answer on a quiz or on an exam, those bullet points are going to provide you with the particulars that you need. But you don't want to be writing out whole sentences about specific facts. Bullet point specific facts, summarize whatever is the main essence of that chunk of the lecture for that slide. All right, let's go ahead and get on to the world up to the 17th century. We're going to start in the eastern portion of Asia and work our way west across the globe. And Japan is that far, far eastern portion of Asia. You may have heard it referred to as the land of the rising sun. As a matter of fact, the actual name for Japan in Japanese is Nihon, which kind of translates as origin of the sun. So the Japanese have long had a sense of being this first land that the sun comes up on as it makes its way across the rest of the world. It's a fairly young civilization. The Japanese people first came to the main Japanese island of Honshu around the year 1000 BCE, or maybe all the way up until 400 BCE. And even then, they were not really unified as a civilization until around the year 400 CE, when they were united around an imperial family based out of the Yamato portion of Honshu, here in this little yellow spot. As a matter of fact, that imperial clan that was able to unite all the people, or the Japanese-speaking people that lived on Honshu at the time, they are still the emperors of Japan. They are the oldest royal dynasty in the world. Now, for most of their early history, the Japanese people only lived on the southwest portion of Honshu and the island of Kyushu, that one very far down to the south. Those we'll see here in a moment. Eventually, the Japanese came to occupy all of what we think of as the Japanese islands, all the islands here on this map. Most of the people of Japan practice a religion called Shinto. Shinto is a polytheistic religion. That means it believes in multiple gods. It believes that the emperor is actually a living god. The imperial family were descendants of the sun goddess. And you might remember that the Japanese people have long seen themselves as the origin of the sun, or that their land is the origin, the beginning of the sun's arc across the sky. Now, even though the emperors were seen as living gods, and really still are by many, by the time we get to the year 1185 CE, military dictators were taking control of running the Japanese state. These military men were called shoguns. Shogun essentially means commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And once these military dictators took over, emperors continued, but they just acted as figureheads. That's going to be important as we move through Japanese history. Be aware the emperors didn't go away, but they were always seen as figureheads underneath the shogun who actually ran the state. And at this point in 1185, when the shoguns first started taking control, or started solidifying their control of Japan, Japan really turned into what we could call a feudal society. Very similar to what you can think of in medieval Europe. So just as Europe had lords, dukes and counts and whatnot, Japan had daimyo. Just as Europe had knights, Japan had samurai. And in both cases, almost everybody was a peasant. But by the mid-15th century, shoguns lost control over the realm. All of the different daimyo were starting to assert themselves. This is what happens in a lot of feudal countries. If you're familiar at all with medieval European history, you would know that the kings very rarely had control over all of their lords. And so from the mid-15th century all the way through the 16th century, that is, all the way through the 1500s, Japan was in a civil war, a time that was called the Warring States period. And in the middle of the Civil War, in the middle of the 16th century, in the middle of the 1500s, a new group of people, Europeans, showed up. And when these Europeans showed up, they introduced guns and Christianity to Japan. Guns made the Civil War even bloodier, and Christianity didn't gain a whole lot of ground, but where it did, it very often undermined traditional social values. That was the goal of missionaries, was to bring Japan out of their traditional values and into the traditional values of Christianity. But anybody living in our society today knows that when you make changes to the fabric of society, it will cause some stress and even more chaos. Highly problematic in the middle of a civil war. Now in 1603, Japan was finally reunified underneath a man named Tokugawa Ieyasu. He created what we call the Tokugawa shogunate. It lasted from 1603 up to 1868. The Tokugawa shogunate is often also called the Edo period. The capital of the shogunate was established at Edo. Edo is actually modern Tokyo. So this is when you could think of Tokyo becoming the capital of Japan. And it's considered to be a golden age of Japanese culture. If you've ever heard of things like kabuki or Japanese woodblock paintings, all of this comes out of the Edo period or the Tokugawa shogunate. And again, emperors still continued on as figureheads for the nation, as that thing that everybody could look to and say, that is what makes us Japanese. The emperor is the focus of our thoughts, and again, the focus of our religion as a living god, a descendant of the sun goddess, the protectress of Japan. At the beginning of the Tokugawa shogunate, concerns about foreign influence really started to grow. Remember, Christianity and guns really fueled additional chaos within the Japanese Civil War, and there were still plenty of people who were trying to trade for more guns. There were still lots of missionary work that was taking place. There had been, during the Warring States period, some significant pushback against Christianity, but it did continue on. And in the year 1614, the shogun decided that he was going to expel all of the Christians from Japan, essentially to send all the Europeans home so that the Japanese culture in his mind could start focusing once again on itself. Though there was a significant, not large, but a significant number of Japanese people who went underground with their Christianity, practicing it at least all the way up until the 20th century. But expelling the Christians was not enough, and in 1635, the shogun put out the, quote, closed country edict, Sokoku. This made it actually illegal for Japanese people to leave the islands or to leave and then try to come back. If you got caught trying to leave, or if you got caught trying to come back into the island from somewhere else, it was the death penalty. The Tokugawa shogunate really wanted to turn everything inwards in a way that kept the Japanese identity and ethnicity pure. As we're going to see, this is never a good way to try to run a civilization. He did still allow for some foreign trade only in one port, in the southern port of Nagasaki, and he allowed the Dutch Europeans to trade there. He had kicked the Portuguese out, wasn't letting them come back, and he let Chinese trade there. But beyond that, Japan had walled itself off from the outside world for the rest of the Tokugawa shogunate, or at least most of it. Now, as you can see on this map, Japanese lands had actually grown quite a bit during the Warring States period. They had conquered further and further north, taking the southern island of Shikoku as well, and the Ryukyu Islands, those ones that trail off down to the south. Though they had not conquered all of Hokkaido Island, the northernmost island, and that is an area that still had indigenous people to the Japanese islands who weren't Japanese. You might remember they said the Japanese people showed up somewhere between 1000 and 400 BCE on the Japanese islands, but there were other people there before them for thousands of years. And the descendants of some of those folk still lived up in the north. They are called the Ainu. And as we're going to see later on, the Ainu have a history of being treated terribly by the Japanese government. So by the time we get to the dawn of the 17th century, by the time we get to the early 1600s, Japan had walled itself off from the outside world and was living in its own little feudal state, complete with an emperor, a shogun, daimyos who all obeyed the shogun for the most part, and samurai who worked for those daimyos or worked for those lords. At the beginning of the 17th century, Korea was still ruled by a group called the Joseon dynasty. The Joseon had ruled over Korea ever since 1392, and they're going to continue on actually up until 1897 and technically a little bit past 1897. When we get there, I'll explain that more clearly. Now, for most of its history, Korea was a tributary state of China. China has always seen itself as the powerhouse of East Asia, and rightfully so. It has been the strongest nation of East Asia for almost all of history. In fact, China often would call itself the Middle Kingdom because it was in the middle of everything, or at least everything that mattered to the Chinese. Tributary states would send representatives to pay respect to the Chinese emperor every now and then. Some might do it every couple of years, some might do it every few decades. But in sending your representatives, quite often your own king, to the Japanese emperor where they would kowtow, they would completely get on the ground in front of the emperor to pay respect, to see the emperor as the emperor of all of East Asia, allowing some kings to exist in different areas. That allowed those countries then to have trading rights with China, and it allowed them to ask for Chinese military assistance. Well, Korea, being right there on the border of China, had for quite some time, even before the Joseon dynasty, been a tributary state of China. It really couldn't make a lot of moves, at least in terms of its foreign affairs, without discussing things with the Chinese emperor first. Now, throughout all these tributary states, aristocrats often copied Chinese customs. You can imagine if you're trying to make nice with the Chinese, well, you're going to want to learn their language and their writing style and the different types of manners they have and maybe even the religions that they practice. So throughout the tributary states of China, we see a spread of Confucianism. Confucianism is just a philosophy that emphasized conforming to one society, to know your own place in it, always knowing how to act in a subordinate or superior position, and always knowing which position you're in. So Confucianism really emphasizes if you are a parent, your job is to take care of your kid. If you're a kid, your job is to be obedient. And it doesn't matter if your parents are good or not. You're still supposed to be obedient. And for parents, it doesn't matter if your kids are brats or not. You're still supposed to take care of them. This would happen all throughout society. Of course, Confucianism was pretty patriarchal, and so there was the idea that all women should be subordinate to all men. Of course, all people within the realm should be subordinate to their emperor, but if they were lower ranking than a governor or a mayor or a city clerk, they should be obedient to them as well. So Confucianism really is all about know your place. And of course, Koreans adopted this. They also adopted Buddhism. Buddhism is a religion that believes in reincarnation. It believes that after you die, you are going to come back again into a new body. But for Buddhism, the goal is to become detached from ourselves and one with the universe. So Buddhists are always trying to stop caring about, what do I like? They don't want to necessarily be pursuing love, trying to pursue wealth or pursue a career. What they want to do is stop wanting things. And if you can stop wanting things, your own identity will melt away and you won't be reborn again. You won't be having to come back to this difficult life over and over again. You will just become one with the universe. And of course, this is a Korean Confucian temple here on our left and a Korean Buddhist pagoda on our right. China, the oldest civilization on Earth. It has a writing system that can be traced back to the year 1500 BCE, but the civilization probably goes back 500 years before that. There are dozens of ethnic minority groups who live throughout China. For example, the Tibetans who live in Tibet, which is part of China, or the Uyghurs who live in the western portion of China. But when you think of Chinese ethnically speaking, the ethnic Chinese folk are called the Han. So whenever you hear this word Han or Han Chinese, be aware that that source is referring to the ethnically Chinese folk. Not everybody that lives in China is Han. Now, China is the home of Confucianism. It's where it came from. But it also has a sizable majority of people who practice Buddhism. And there is a third great teaching that's very popular in China that's known as Taoism. It's a folk religion that believes in the importance of balance. You might be familiar with the symbol of the yin-yang, light and dark, hot and cold, hard and soft, night and day. The idea that everything in the world has a polar opposite, and one is not better than the other. The yin and yang is not good and evil. It's just two sides of the same coin. And Taoists believe that if you could achieve perfect balance, perfect harmony between every yin and yang in your existence, you can gain powers like immortality or the ability to be impervious to bullets. Remember this, because this is going to come up later on. But be aware that before China became a communist country as it is in the modern day, it was a country that was centered on what they call the three teachings: Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Now, for all of its history up until we get to the modern period, China was the absolute dominant power in East and in Southeast Asia. So we're going to see it's going to falter a little bit in the 1800s until it really starts coming up over the last few decades again. But the reason that China is really going to falter by the time we get to the late 1800s is that by the time we get to the early modern period, China was doing something very similar to Japan. It was walling itself off. From the late 1200s through most of the 14th century, most of the 1300s, China was ruled by a group of people called the Mongols. That is to say, the Han Chinese were still there, their civilization still existed, but the government was taken over by Mongols. But finally in 1368, the Han were able to push the Mongols out and they set up what was called the Ming Dynasty. 1368 to 1644 CE is the Ming Dynasty. And the Ming Dynasty was super inward looking. They had just gotten rid of these foreigners, and what they wanted to make sure was that no other foreigners would come into their land, not just in terms of conquering them militarily, but they wanted to make sure that their culture remained pure, purely Chinese. And so they did not want to have any outsiders making their way into their country. They built the Great Wall of China in the north, specifically to keep the Mongols out. They didn't allow Chinese subjects to sail to foreign lands for trade. And like the Japanese, they limited the ports that foreign traders could actually come and visit. So there was still some trading with outside groups if they were tributary states. They were the only ones that were allowed in. But even those folks had to really jump through some hoops before they could trade with a handful of Chinese merchants. Now in the year 1516, the Europeans did show up to trade and they were turned away. Of course, the next thing the Europeans did is they just started smuggling things in. They wanted trade with China. That was a big part of the reason why Christopher Columbus had sailed across the ocean. It's why they've been doing so much exploring for decades before that, and they were determined to still trade with China even if the Chinese government wasn't going to let them. Finally, in the year 1557, the Ming Dynasty allowed the Portuguese to settle down into a city called Macau as merchants. The idea being that they wanted to be able to keep an eye on them and actually regulate this trade instead of having to deal with all of these issues with smuggling. Now, this Ming strategy of isolationism ultimately hurt them pretty bad, particularly their economy. By the time we get to the early 17th century, by the time we get to the 1600s, the Ming Dynasty was getting incredibly weak. And in 1644, a group called the Manchus conquered China. These Manchus were actually cousins of the Mongols, the people who had conquered China beforehand, and they set up a new dynasty called the Qing, which lasted from 1636 to 1912. In addition to conquering the Ming, as a matter of fact, the Qing went on to conquer places like Tibet and Xinjiang. This is what creates the borders of modern China that we're familiar with in the modern day. Now, the Qing weren't as isolationist as the Ming Dynasty, but they still worked to keep out foreign influence, particularly European influence. This policy will eventually allow Europe to pass them up economically and technologically. If you close yourself off to the outside world, you're going to get passed up by the outside world. And the rise of Europe and the pressure it was able to put on the Qing dynasty, combined with Han dissatisfaction of being ruled by foreigners, is going to lead to Qing decline in the 19th century and, of course, finally being overthrown in 1912. But it's going to be a while before we get to that. Now, just to the south of those East Asian countries of China, Korea, Mongolia, and Japan is Southeast Asia. Now, Southeast Asia is a super diverse place, many different peoples, languages, and kingdoms. For example, Vietnam, over here on the east coast of Southeast Asia. Vietnam had long been under the influence of China. It had been one of China's tributary states, and so in addition to its folk religions, Buddhism was and is practiced there, and Confucianism has heavily impacted Vietnamese culture. Now, the rest of mainland Southeast Asia have historically been influenced by India. This includes the kingdoms of places like Burma, modern-day Myanmar, and the Kingdom of Thailand, which back in the day was often known as Siam. Though Thailand was also a tributary state to China, its culture had been significantly impacted by India. And by the time we get to the dawn of the early modern period, so the 1500s, the islands of Southeast Asia were mostly controlled by Islamic sultanates. A sultanate is just a kingdom. A sultan is just a king. And to this day, most of the people who live in Southeast Asia are Muslim. Now, Europeans, as they were exploring the world, called these the East Indies or the Spice Islands. More on that later, but just be aware when you think of these islands down here of Southeast Asia, East Indies, Spice Islands, Muslim citizens, keep all that in the back of your mind. In modern times, most of these islands are called Indonesia. Of course, the Philippines are their own group. Europeans, once they showed up here, pretty quickly started colonizing the region. The Sultan of Malacca, or in the Malay Sultanates, controlled the Straits of Malaya, or the Straits of Malacca, this little band of water right here. These were really the primary route to get to China, and Malacca was a Chinese tributary state. So they can control the waters that went to China. So in 1511, Malacca was conquered by the Portuguese. In 1565, the Spanish claimed the Philippines as their own. As a matter of fact, the islands are named after King Philip. And at the dawn of the 17th century, the early 1600s, the Dutch began taking control of all the rest of the islands of Indonesia. We're not going to talk a whole lot about Australia in this course, but it is going to pop up a few times, and it is one of the last places that will actually be settled by Europeans, though one of the first places in the world settled by humans. It's the home of the Aboriginal peoples, various tribes of people who migrated directly from Africa 50,000 years ago, possibly the oldest culture in existence. Europeans first discovered Australia in the early 1500s, but did not start colonizing it until the end of the 18th century, until the end of the 1700s. Now, until the end of the 20th century, until around the 1950s or so, almost all of South Asia was referred to as India. In the modern day, there are states like Pakistan and Bangladesh that are separate from India. But when you hear that term South Asia, at least in the historical terms, in the early modern period or beforehand, you can be thinking India. Throughout its history, India has rarely been a unified kingdom. It's usually divided amongst several different kingdoms and principalities. The original religion of India, or at least modern day India, is Hinduism. Hinduism is a polytheistic, decentralized religion, so it worships many gods. It has a whole ton of different holy books and different priesthoods. It's not like Christianity that has the Bible, right? And that you can be Catholic or you can be Protestant, but you're all part of that one teaching of Christianity. In Hinduism, there are many, many different takes on how to interpret all of these different holy books. You can see why it might be difficult to create a unified state in such a decentralized culture. Now, an important feature of Hinduism is the caste system. This is something that Hindus believe in, that people are born into certain castes. A caste is a social class, and you can't leave them. So if you're born into a priestly family, you have to become a priest. If you are born into a family of bakers, you have to marry somebody who is also born into a family of bakers, and you are going to be a baker. Everybody is tied to their lot in life. But Hinduism also believes in reincarnation, the idea of being born again into a new body after you die. And if one lives a good life, they receive what we would call good karma, and they get reborn into a higher caste. So if you're born into a baker family, be a really good baker and be an honest person and care about your family and do everything that your caste expects of you. And in your next life, maybe you can be a blacksmith or a goldsmith or a warrior. Now, in the 13th century, in the 1200s CE, Muslim rulers took over the northern portion of India, and to this day, there is a sizable Muslim population throughout South Asia. And in 1498, the Portuguese first landed in India. Europeans started setting up trade forts all along India's coast, and beginning in the 16th century, in the 1500s, a group called the Mughals started conquering India from the north. They were cousins of the Mongols, and they themselves were Muslim. And by the time we got to the dawn of the 17th century, the early 1600s, the Mughals ruled over almost all of India. After this peak, they started losing power, which will end up giving Europeans a chance to take more control. And by the time we get to the mid-1800s, Europeans are going to take total control. Now, I want to pause here Some of our videos in this course are going to be quite short, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Some of them, like this one, are going to be a little bit longer. Pausing videos is your friend. There's no reason why you have to sit here and watch this for 40 minutes. What I want you to do right now is I want you to take the notes that you have taken up until this moment, and I want you to send them to me. Email them to me in Canvas. I just want to get a chance to give you some feedback on how you're taking your notes and give you a chance to get a little bit of extra credit by demonstrating that you have watched the video at least this far. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the Middle East. Keep pushing west. At the dawn of the 17th century, the early 1600s, the Ottoman Empire controlled modern-day Turkey as well as most Arab lands in the Middle East and North Africa. So what we would think of as modern-day Iraq, Syria, Palestine, parts of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria. All parts of the Ottoman Empire. And, as you can see on this map, they controlled a big chunk of Southeast Europe. Now, Ottomans were Turkish people who had originally came from Central Asia. They pioneered early modern military tactics, though. The idea of having uniformed professional soldiers who are all taught to march and fight in formation, the use of muskets and cannons by everybody in the military instead of a few select rich folk. And like most Arabs, Ottoman Turks were Muslim, and they were part of what's called the Sunni sect of Islam. We're not going to get deep into it, but you do need to be aware of the fact that Islam has two major sects to it, two major sections, the Sunni and the Shiite. The vast majority of Muslims are Sunni, probably around 80, maybe even 90% are Sunni. And the Sunni have a tradition of building religious ideas as a community through consensus, through scholars debating things. There is this other smaller sect, though, called the Shiites, and Shiites have a tradition of following individual, you could say, preachers, though it wouldn't be quite accurate to say that Islam has preachers per se, but religious leaders. Throughout most of their history, these two groups have lived pretty well side by side. There's rivalries, just like throughout European history, there's been Catholic and Protestant rivalries, also two different sects or sections of Christianity, of a religion. But be aware of the fact that at this point in history, there was not outright war normally between Sunnis and Shiites as is happening in the modern day, and that the Ottomans themselves, like most Muslims, were Sunni. And for the Ottomans, the 17th century, the 1600s, was really the peak of their power. In the 18th and 19th centuries, in the 1700s and 1800s, they will end up going into a long, slow decline. When they finally fall after World War I, one of the effects of the fall of the Ottoman Empire is that the Arabs that had been underneath their colonial rule for hundreds of years, and I should point out here that the Ottomans, the Ottoman Turks, lived in modern-day Turkey on this little peninsula up here. Those other lands of Iraq and Syria and Egypt and parts of Saudi Arabia, those were homes of Arab folk who had been conquered and colonized by the Ottoman Empire. You need to be aware of this because this is going to be huge when we start looking at the history of the modern Middle East. And so the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the way the Europeans also stepped in to create new colonies for themselves is going to be the source of many modern Middle Eastern issues. Now, in the northeast portion of the Middle East, over here in purple, Persia was a separate power from the Ottomans, and the Persians had for a long time been an independent power of other Arab groups or other groups in the Middle East. Now, Persia is the ancient name for this region, though you may know it in the modern day as Iran, and certainly many of the people that were living there in the 15, 16, 1700s would have called themselves Iranians. A dynasty called the Safavids were able to take power at the dawn of the 16th century. They solidified Iran as a Shiite Muslim country. Now, before that, there were plenty of Shiites that lived throughout Persia or lived throughout Iran, but it's the Safavids who really make it clearly in a Shiite land or a Shia land that really didn't have a place in it for Sunnis, or at least for Sunnis to partake in different institutions. And that's going to be important because in the modern day, the divide between Sunni Arabs and Shiite Persians is going to be one of the rubs in the Middle East. So I just want you to be aware of that distinction, that minority sect of Shiites really becoming solidified in Persia underneath the Safavid dynasty. Next up is Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, Sub-Saharan Africa is anything that is south of the Saharan Desert in Africa, though quite often, as you can see on this map, that would also include some lands that are still somewhat in the Saharan Desert. And I just want to draw your attention to the different empires, or where the focus of the different empires have been. Of course, we've had places like Egypt and the major kingdoms to the south of it, like the Kingdom of Kush, but the big empires of Africa have traditionally been in West Africa. This is where we have the Songhai, the Mali, the Empire of Ghana, and the east coast of Africa, for much of its history, or at least going into the early modern period, was studded with all these rich city-states. Over here where you see the Swahili coast. Up and down the Swahili coast, there were individual cities. We call them city-states because they weren't part of the larger kingdom. They governed themselves. But these city-states made a ton of money on the Indian Ocean trade. They traded with the Middle East. They traded with India. They traded with Southeast Asia, with Indonesia, even sometimes getting all the way over to China. And so merchant states, as we're going to see pretty shortly here as this course progresses, merchant states make money. Agrarian states, states that focus primarily on agriculture, generally don't. Now, by the time we get to the dawn of the 17th century, the early 1600s, all of those city-states along the Swahili coast were destroyed, or they were controlled by Europeans, mostly by Portuguese. The West African empires, by the time we get to the 1600s, were no more. But there were some major kingdoms that had emerged along the coast of West and Central Africa. So the Kingdom of Congo, Benin, Dahomey, these kingdoms generally made their wealth off the slave trade with Europeans. I want to emphasize this. We'll get into this more when we get to Africa. Slavery has been in just about every civilization going all the way back to the beginning of civilization, and African kingdoms were no different. But by the time we get to the 17th century, because of the demand for slaves, as we'll be talking about later on, the Europeans who had all of these large plantations over in the Americas, they needed people to work them. And it wasn't work that they were going to be able to pay people to do and still make the ridiculous profit that they wanted to make off of it. So what they did is they actually started trading with coastal African groups who would go in, they would take people from the interior of Africa, kidnap folks, and sell them to Europeans, usually for guns. Those guns, of course, made it easier for them to capture other Africans from the interior, to sell more, to create more guns. And then we end up with these trading kingdoms, these slave trading kingdoms of Africa's west and central coasts. And the slave trade, while it certainly happened quite often in the 1500s, it really started going in earnest in the 17th century, in the 1600s, and it exploded to horrific proportions in the 18th century, in the 1700s. That slave trade, along with the destruction of those city-states and any other power base by the Europeans, tore sub-Saharan Africa apart both socially and economically. And we will be talking about that as we move forward in this course. Europe. For most of its history, most of Europe has actually been what we would call a backwater. If you go way back to the classical age, places like Italy, Spain, and France flourished underneath the Roman Empire. But when this western portion of the Roman Empire fell in the 400s, it sent all of Europe into its medieval period. Medieval period of Europe lasted from around 500 to around the year 1500 CE. It was an era of warlords. Kings, lords, knights were really just gangsters fighting for territory, wealth, and fame. But as the Middle Ages progressed, Southern Europe did benefit from some contact with the Islamic world. From around the years 700 to 1000 CE, most of Spain was actually ruled by Muslims. The last Muslim king wasn't defeated until 1492, but it's really around 700 to 1000 that is the high point of Muslim kingdoms in Spain. And during the Middle Ages, during this medieval period, the Islamic world was an intellectual center of the world. It made major scientific and artistic advancements. European learning from Islamic culture is part of what set off the Renaissance in the 14th century. Some of the technology they learned came straight from Arabs, algebra, medical advances, but some of it came from India through those Arabic and Islamic kingdoms. The numerals that we call Arabic numerals, those actually were invented in India. And some of the things that Europeans learned that set off the Renaissance came from China via Islamic kingdoms and the Mongols. Things like gunpowder and the compass. In other words, during this medieval period, Europe wasn't making a whole lot of progress. But by the time we get to the second half of the medieval period, Europe is starting to soak up knowledge, particularly in the south, knowledge that was coming from or through Islamic kingdoms that were surrounding them. In the 15th century, in the 1400s, Portugal started exploring the West African coast. They were looking for trading goods and, more importantly to them, trading routes that would get them around the Ottoman Empire so they could have direct access to places like India, the Spice Islands, and China. And as Portugal was making its way around Africa slowly but surely in 1492, after the Spanish monarchs defeated the last Islamic kingdom on the peninsula, Spain sent Columbus across the Atlantic in an attempt to find a different way to the east. Since Portugal controlled a lot of the African coast, Spain needed a different direction to get directly towards China, the Spice Islands, and India. Of course, we all know that Columbus ended up landing in the Americas. Most specifically, he landed in the Caribbean. He always insisted that he had actually landed in India and he called the native peoples Indians. He never accepted that he had actually discovered or ran into a brand new continent. And in the 16th century, in the 1500s, Spain and Portugal started making tons of money off of these explorations. Spain made money off its colonies in the Americas. Portugal made it off its trading forts in Africa and Asia. And in the dawn of the 17th century, the early 1600s, France, England, and the Netherlands started exploring the seas, creating colonies and trade forts for themselves. Imperial competition between all of these different West European states led to technological innovations, better ships, better guns. This made it easier for Europe to take wealth from other people. More wealth allowed them to create more innovation. It's the wealth that Europe took from other civilizations that really transformed it from a backwater and turned it into the sole world power of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and still a major world power to this day. And finally, the Americas. The civilizations of the Western Hemisphere, that's where the Americas are at, developed independently of those in Eurasia and Africa. Central America was home to the largest of those civilizations, the Olmecs, who existed from around 1200 to around 400 BCE, the Mayans from the 3rd to the 10th centuries CE, the Toltecs from the 10th to the 12th, and finally the Aztecs from the 14th to the early 16th centuries. Much of South America was dominated by the Amazon rainforest, which meant that it was not a great place to create an empire. It's hard to create empires in rainforests. But the Incas did create a very complex civilization on the western portion of South Africa, on the west coast, from around the 15th century, again, up to the early 16th. North America has also had several large civilizations. The western half and far north are not really conducive to large-scale agriculture, so the areas that we would think of as California, Utah, Montana, they're too hot, they're too dry, and if you're going up into Canada, too cold. And agriculture is a cornerstone of civilization. Of course, in the modern day, there's a lot of ranching that takes place there, but not a ton of crop growing. But the eastern portion of the Americas, everything east of the Missouri, has great climate for growing things. And it's in this region that we have the mound building cultures that emerged as early as 3500 BCE. They really reached their height in the Mississippian civilization that lasted from around the 11th to around the 16th century CE. But even that Mississippian civilization was not really a unified empire. People lived in independent, or at least we think, independent cities. Many of these cities were fortified. They made use of agriculture and created complex societies. Remember, you don't need an empire to have a complex society. Of course, in 1492, the Europeans, in this case the Spanish, made their first landfall in the Caribbean, and they made contact with the Taino people of the Greater Antilles. The Greater Antilles are all these big islands like Cuba and Hispaniola and Jamaica and Puerto Rico. The Europeans, of course, showed up with steel armor and swords, guns and horses, though the most devastating weapon they brought with them, unintentionally, was disease, most notably measles, the flu, and smallpox. Remember, the Americas developed separately from those other civilizations. There was zero immunity to any of those diseases. Getting the flu was very, very often a death sentence for Native Americans. And within 60 years after landfall, the Taino civilization was wiped out. Now, again, a lot of this came from disease, though it should be mentioned, and we're not going to be able to get into it very deeply in this course, but the brutality that these people were treated with was insane. We have Spanish writers that talk about how conquistadors would have bets between each other as to how many hacks of their sword it would take to split a baby in two. It was bad news. As these diseases spread across the continents of the Americas, around 90% of the indigenous people were wiped out. This made it very easy for later conquerors to come in and take over. Spain soon went on to the mainland. In 1521, Cortes sacked the Aztec capital, ending that civilization. And in 1536, the Incan Empire was defeated. They had some holdouts that continued all the way until 1572, but the Incan Empire itself was really gone after 1536. In 1532, the Portuguese began colonizing modern-day Brazil. And in the second half of the 16th century, about 100 years into all of this, England, France, and the Netherlands began exploring the Americas on a small scale. It's in the 17th century that they really began colonization. The Caribbean islands were considered to be prime real estate. They were called the West Indies. Again, because Columbus couldn't admit his mistake. And they were the absolute best place to grow sugar, which was the big money maker for people who own plantations. They were also pretty good for tobacco, which also made a pretty good chunk of money. And as I said before, it's in the 17th century when kidnapping Africans to be enslaved in the Americas really started getting going. It is primarily because of the English and the French and the Dutch of the Netherlands. But in addition to these Caribbean colonies, they also started laying down colonies on the east coast of North America. The English colonized the southern part, modern-day Virginia and the Carolinas. The Dutch colonized modern New York and New Jersey. Then the English colonized the area of what we would call New England in the modern day. And France colonized the east coast of modern Canada. Once these colonies were well established, the colonists began moving inland, taking lands from indigenous people as they went. And like I said, this was made possible by the decimation of the diseases that had been ravaging the continent for over a century. So at the dawn of the 1600s, Europe was transforming itself from a backwater, starting to take over every last part of the globe: Japan, China, Africa, India, the Americas. And they were becoming this very complex, very thoughtful civilization that was starting to produce things like science and democracy. But it came at a price. It came at the price of every other civilization on Earth. That's going to be a lot of what we're going to be looking at throughout this course.